2025 is the year that I want to get into board games. Now, I already play a lot of board games off the channel, but I'd love to bring more of that onto the channel. I'd like to diversify the catalogue, as it were. And that's where Steamforged Games come in and ask me to take a look on my spin and what I do with Hearts of Iron, the board game, which is a brand new game coming from Steamforged Games based on the critically acclaimed game of the same name, Hearts of Iron. But to make it abundantly clear up front, this is not a review, this is a showcase of the game that is sponsored by Steamforged Games for their new game that is coming to GameFound on Thursday the 23rd of January. Now, I play a lot of games on the channel, but I also do a lot of painting on the channel, as you might know. So the question is, when we have a board game like Hearts of Iron, should we be painting them? And I suppose you're about to find out. Hearts of Iron is a strategic alternate history board game based during the 1939 and 1945 period. And I say alternate history, you can either play it historically or you can play it with an alternate history twist, which is why I think it's a pretty cool board game. But they also come with little figures that represent each of your units that are for the different factions. You have infantry, tanks, planes and boats for the 3 factions available in this demo game, but there's actually 5 playable factions in the game, but I have United Kingdom, Germany and the Soviet Union. And whilst these are prototype 3D prints, they are going to be plastic in the box for the premium version of the board game, I believe, and they are extremely well detailed for something that is quite small. So I'm going to be painting these miniatures and asking the question, should you paint board game miniatures even if they're only this big? Whilst also giving you a rundown of the game and its mechanics and telling you why you should consider backing it on GameFound today. Hearts of Iron, the board game, is based on Hearts of Iron, the video game, which is set during World War II. 2 to 5 players take control of a faction, choose the ideology for that faction, hence the alternate history, and then go forth to produce units, forge alliances, or start wars. For example, I've got the Soviet Union country here, which is one half of the track for your faction, and then you can take your ideology, such as King's Party, and they actually slot together to make your full tracker for the game, which is actually such a cool way to play it, because it shows you your different traits and your different ways to score depending on what country and what ideology that country is going to be playing as. I just think this little functionality of sliding the cards together is really neat. I think it's really satisfying. You decide the ideology for your country by choosing an end game scoring card, which is what you're working towards throughout the 6 rounds of the game, which represent each year of the war. I'm going to try and paint all these miniatures using just TT Combat paints, and I'm going to start out with the Soviet Union, which are the brown pieces. I'm going to stick all the figures to a shot glass using a little bit of blue tack or white tack to hold it while I'm trying to paint it, and then prime it in a neutral tone of the Colourforge standard grey. And using Admiralty grey, I'm going to dry brush all of the miniatures as well. This is where we add a little bit of moisture to the brush, ironically when you call it dry brush. Wipe off the excess on MDF or a piece of tissue paper and slap this all over the miniature to bring out the edges, to make the details stand out a little bit more, so we know what we're working with. And we put them side by side, we can see one's highly detailed, you can see all the bits that they've actually designed, and one's looking a little flat now compared. The reason I dry brushed a mini before going over with this green paint is just so we can see more of the details. It's a little easy to see because we're working with something that's so small. Here I've got grey, marsh green, trench brown and tank green, I think. And I'm just going to be trying to use a limited drab green palette to paint all of these. And I'm going to start out with a T34 and I'm going to base coat this drab green I've mixed up. I'm not really thinking too far ahead about what green I'm using, whether it's the right shade. I'm just looking at a picture and trying to copy it best I can. Next up, I paint anything that's going to be black or look a bit metallic with a mixture of black and brown. And then I use light grey to paint all the insides of the wheels. I'm actually mixing the tank green into all of the colours just to kind of give it like a unified tone, because the green and the browns, if we mix them into all of the colours, all of them are going to look drab, which is going to be quite handy. And then same again, where we're going to wash it all over with umber wash, but with cold green mixed in, again to give it that dirty drab look together. I'm just going to wash this all over. It's a small miniature, it's not going to take us that long to paint. Once the wash is dry, we're going to reintroduce some of those browns again on the tracks and metallics to make them look a little bit more shiny. And then we're going to add a little bit of light grey to the tank green that we've mixed up, just to make a highlight colour, to highlight all the edges, to really make this little guy pop. And I don't need transfers or decals for these sorts of miniatures, so I'm very poorly going to freehand a star onto the tank. And I'm just neating it up with the base colour again. Then on the flip side, write number 52, because I'm pretty sure I saw this in one of the pictures I was looking at. As you can see, next to this paint pot, this is a small little guy. A very, very small mini. But the Cromwell, I painted it in a very similar way, just with a deeper green base coat, more of that marsh green in there this time. But otherwise, I just painted it, washed it, and then highlighted it, and then painted the relevant symbols onto it. But then for the Tiger tank, I went for a desert camo type scheme, which is probably not going to fit this game of where the war's breaking out. But I thought it looked cool and different. So I base coated it all in tan, and then added some bone to the tan to make the camo pattern, before painting the metallics and black the same way, and then washing it all over with umber and green again, keeping that drab colour to kind of tie them all together. Once that wash is dried, we can go in and reapply the base coats to build that contrast, and then highlight the edges, just adding a little bit of white or bone to the colours to highlight the highest points. And then we can paint the white cross by starting with the white and making out the rough shape, and then filling in the gap in the middle using black, because it's easier to paint the white before the black. And again, these are so small, so don't worry if they look a bit weird. They look good when they're on the table. So that's the 3 tanks painted. I'm like really chuffed with them. I think they look really sweet and they really look the part. And they didn't actually take me that long to paint. So let me tell you a little bit more about the game before we paint the planes. When taking control of each country, you're going to be managing their resource tracker, which is going to track your production, your politics, and your manpower. As I said, this is based on a real-time strategy game. You're going to be managing those resources quite a lot. The resource tracker has like a list of examples of like how the turn runs out. So you have the engine phase, the action phase, the political phase, the conflict phase, and then the end phase, which is just like what makes up a turn. And essentially you have stability, which is kind of like, let's say, upkeep costs. It's like how much you have to spend to make sure that you keep gaining resources, or if you start the stability drops and you're not paying enough upkeep, you can slowly drop down and lose resources. But essentially you're going to be using your political power to either align and ally with other countries, or you're going to be using it to tell everyone that you're ready to start a war. You're going to be using production to produce units, and you're also going to be using manpower to move those units around and like get them to where they need to be, and use them to then go on fight wars or just protect your borders. So as I said, we start with the engine phase, which is kind of where you play a card, one of the 5 engine cards you have in your hand, and kind of decide like what you're planning to do that turn, because each engine card will provide resources to your tracker that we previously mentioned, such as industrial push, which is going to gain you political power, or more so if you have no political power at all. But then as a bonus, as well as gaining your political power, it's going to allow you to build extra factories compared to everyone else, because you are pushing for that industrial push. It's kind of in the name. After the engine phase, we have the action phase, which is made up of 5 different steps. First out, you start with construction. Construction is obviously where we're going to be able to spend manpower to produce factories. Factories are going to be used to generate production, and then production is used to generate units. After construction, we move on to the research phase, where players can use their resources to research into stronger units, such as Tank 2, obviously being a better version of the original tank. They can also increase their defense systems, their radio detection, which allows you to look at other people's hands, and also improve communication, which essentially allows you to move your units more than other people would be. And to move around those upgraded units, you're going to need ships to travel across sea. I'm going to paint those next. Now, the nice things about the miniatures in this board game is they're all in scale with each other. So obviously you have the tanks, which I think are like a really good scale, but then the boats are obviously a lot larger than the tanks, but they're in scale with each other. Now, as well as I think the miniatures are super highly detailed to this scale, the problem is with the warships, they are going to look very similar. They are all essentially grey with tan decks and then red bodies. Obviously, each miniature represents each ship that it's representing really well, but the only real difference here is some markings on the German Bismarck-class warship, so I can't really teach them much about it, but they look really cool when they're done. So moving on to the planes. So we'll start with the Spitfire, and the Spitfire actually has the markings like designed onto the miniature, which is great. I believe they're called the Roundel. But we'll start out by painting the plane using marsh green for a lot of it. Obviously the planes are going to have camouflage, so I'll just paint on some basic random patterns. Again, I'm just using a picture of a Spitfire just to like as a rough reference. So I'll paint on the marsh green on most of the miniature, and then I'll fill in the gaps using like a blue grey I believe this was a Vega blue with our like greys and whites that we're using. I'm not really like choosing to follow a pattern. I'm just loosely painting one, just roughly from a picture, because it's so small, it honestly doesn't matter. But then we are going to paint the roundel using Throwing Shade blue as our base coat, just to base coat all of the blue on the miniature. And then we'll paint with Capo red in the center, and this really makes it look like a proper plane. It looks sick. It looks so good. It's so funny because I'm just like, I just painted this, and then I'm like, this is like, it's this big. It's literally this big. You know, it's like only just bigger than a 10p. It's ridiculous. It's great. I washed the planes in the same color using that umber green mix, and then once it's dried, again, I just reinforce those colors. I am kind of repeating myself, but I'm just reinforcing the colors and adding a couple of quick highlights just to make them pop and stand out a little bit. For the Soviets, I followed the pretty much the same steps, but rather than going for like a blue camouflage, I went for like a light grey camouflage. I'll be honest, I'm not too hyped about this one. It looked alright when I painted the star on the tail fin and painted the propeller and stuff like that, but I think the Spitfire came out better over all of these two. However, for the Messerschmitt, I actually tried just stippling the colour instead, so rather than trying to like manually paint the camouflage, I just dabbed my brush onto the miniature underneath and just like got random patterns from the edge of the brush. By painting the blue first, because obviously it's a lighter colour, and just dabbing it all underneath and all basically halfway up the plane, and then doing the same effect with the green but going down against it to create that camouflage, and I think that worked a lot better. Now I didn't have as much camouflage on top of the plane, it was just kind of like to blend them together. But I think it worked really well, and I'm probably going to try and use this in other paint jobs as well. I think it's a very quick and easy way to do like quick and easy blending techniques, where you kind of want the colours to blend together, but not really. You want them kind of like to be just on top of each other and layered, and like a nice transition. But except for painting the markings and obviously the yellow tail tips, slightly different colour, I pretty much followed the same process for all of the planes. And again, I think these came out great. So the boats are looking good and the planes are looking good, but I think we can kind of see one little problem with painting a board game. The next phase is the focus phase. This is where you use the focus deck to start utilizing those units you've been building throughout the game. These are kind of like ruses. It's kind of like a ruse deck that you can play them to gain even more resources for more production, etc. Or you can use them to start sabotaging your opponents and working out what they're doing, such as looking at their command tokens, which will show you what their plans are for that turn. You can sell trade agreements for the resources, or you can go straight to war with some other countries. These are essentially little tricks that you can play, but they're also going to be able to either gain your resources or score points, and obviously the more points you score, the more likely you are to win. They also allow you to appoint generals, which are represented by these tokens, and depending which general you have, they're going to buff the units that you have around them. After that, it's the fun one, production phase. And the reason it's the fun one is because where you can use all that production that you've been gaining in the previous part of this turn and spending it to build units, which is what we're painting right now. So the final units that we have yet to paint is the infantry. Now these, along with the tanks, are the perfect scale to paint. There's just the right amount of detail compared to the size that you're trying to work with. The Soviets, I think, are in their like winter uniforms, so they're quite easy to distinguish because you can paint the helmets bright green, you can paint the coat quite long and quite grey, and with that overall drab wash, it really dirties them all down together and really draws all those colours together, and with a couple of highlights, it really starts to look the part. For the British, you can go for the classic tan uniform, and then using just like a bone or a white mixed into the same tan, we can make the colour for all the equipment that he's holding. Painting the boots black, the helmet bright green as well, and then just a couple of metallics and browns for the gun. For the Germans, we can go for a grey helmet and grey trousers. This really makes them stand out against the other ones. We can use tan green for the jackets, and then just some metallics for their equipment because looks like he's holding a grenade and then he's got a gun. And obviously, they've all got black boots. And I think the infantry compared to the boats really start to show the problem with painting board game miniatures, but I've got one final type of mechanic to tell you about. You can spend production to produce the units, and then you can use the manpower to deploy those units around the territories that you control, which is done during the deployment action. And after that, we move on to the political phase. So during the political phase, you can use your political power to either ally with different countries or start wars with them. As I mentioned, you have the focus deck, which we're using to start wars anyway. It's easier to ally with a territory that has a similar ideology to you, and obviously easier to go to war that has a completely different ideology to you. And then once we've done the political phase, we move on to the conflict phase. Okay, this is where you start using your command tokens to command the units that you've produced around the board to move into different territories, whether to defend yourself or to be quite aggressive. And if units meet in different territories, or if you move into a territory you don't own, that's when the war breaks out. After everybody has issued their command tokens and moved all their units, that's when you're going to be resolving battles. This is the fun bit with dice. This game is obviously about war, but it's not only about war. It's about using your political influences to gain your advantages or to disrupt your opponent. As I mentioned, you can use your political power to manage your allegiances with players that are in the game, but also with players that aren't in the game, the NPCs, because there's a lot of nations on here that aren't actually playable. And you can use those territories to move your troops or spawn your troops in other places that you'd normally not be able to get to. However, when it does come to war, you're going to have to resolve conflict. And this is a case of taking your hard and soft attack powers and comparing it against your opponent and deciding what dice you roll to inflict damage. If you inflict enough damage against your opponent and you've got infantry attacking that territory, you can take it for your own and make it your territory. After all the battles are resolved, whether you won or lost, it's time for the end phase. In the end phase, we draw from the event deck. What, you didn't think all those war efforts and espionage would have effects around the world? Funny that. Once you resolve the event cards, you're going to generate resources for the territories you control, which are marked on the board. You then check stability on your resource tracker, you go to score your points, you advance the round tracker, and you move on to the next round. And that's 1 year in the War of Hearts of Iron. And that's basically how you play the game. So the problem with painting board games is not actually the time or the effort, because I actually think the effort of painting these miniatures, they're actually come together really quickly, and I think it's actually worth painting it. And there's not actually that many in the box. I imagine with another 2 factions it might feel a little bit daunting, but the problem is maybe it's exclusive to this game for these types of miniatures, but I think the warships really sell the problem, and they look very similar. And unless you've got like a key 9, you know your history, or you know the tokens that they're using in the game, they all kind of just look the same. They all look very, very similar because the color palettes are all the same. Now, this is only for the scale of them, because the miniatures are designed really well. Only people with a keen eye or like are well versed in warships of World War II will be able to tell the difference at a glance. Now, I think the tanks and the infantry are completely different. I think they look very different on the table. When you're moving them around, it's quite clear which ones they are. I did have an idea where I was going to use like an underglow, kind of like when you highlight a unit in a game, like on an RTS, they kind of like have a glowing aura around them. I was going to try and paint that, but I don't think it'd work, and I didn't want to ruin them for this video. However, I think the minis look really good, and I'm really chuffed that I painted them, and I'm really happy that Steamforged Games to support the channel by sending us a copy of Hearts of Iron to showcase to you guys. This is now available to back on GameFound. You can use my link in the description to check out Hearts of Iron, the board game, and I wouldn't mess around because it's not going to be around forever. So jump on the link and go and have a look at the campaign yourself. But do I recommend painting your board games? Yes. With a small caveat, it's impossible to tell the difference if all the miniatures look very similar at like 3 feet when you put them on the board. However, I do think it looks really, really good compared to just bare plastic. So it's a bit of a funny one. Maybe Hearts of Iron isn't the game to paint, but if you did want to, maybe you've learned something in this video. But it is the game to play, and maybe we'll play it on the channel with enough interest. So let us know if you'd like to see this game being played on the channel soon. But otherwise, thanks so much for watching. Thanks to Steamforged for sponsoring this video, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next one.